Good evening, everyone. We are excited to welcome you at our first talk in 2023. And welcome our first speaker, who is quite a particular character. And I hope he's gonna talk about his personal experience and his professional background more himself. I would just mention that it's particularly important for us to have such a professional with such a personal background and professional background as a first speaker this year, due to very tough for many people 2022 that made a lot of us, I believe, to re-evaluate and rethink some concepts and narratives that we were, let's put it a very straightforward way, that we were fed with sometimes, or we were presented by society, state, family. And it's very important to be very careful and take time, learn, explore that all those things that Josh has been doing for years. And before giving the floor to our speaker, I want to remind you that, as always, we are collecting money and we are fundraising for the evacuation initiative called Helping to Leave. So feel free to leave any donation after the lecture, during the lecture. You can reach me or volunteer. We would be really grateful, and it helps a lot. Thank you so much. And while Josh is fixing everything, yeah, so I think, we're gonna learn a lot about the track from teaching through hitchhiking to anti-war initiatives and anti-military narratives that could be implemented both in studies and in personal life. Yeah, I think I've said enough.
Cool. Thanks, Polina. I feel like the hype is a little high right now. So my name is Josh Nadeau. I'm originally from Canada, but I've been here since April. I was based in St Petersburg and in Russia for quite some time before that. And right now I work mostly in peacebuilding, in dialogue and things like this, but normally I like to give workshops on like how to do that, like why is this important, what are some barriers, but when I was talking to Ben about this, there was this idea that maybe it might be more interesting to do something a little more fun, so maybe talk about getting into this sphere. I can't say getting into this business because sometimes you make no money at all. But how that happens and how I kind of moved from this kind of nomadic bum to being an English teacher with Ben and the team actually, and then getting into this kind of work. So I want to introduce you to some friends of mine, and we'll be speaking through some of their stories, some of my stories, and kind of build a collage of what this one particular journey looked like. So this is Pala. He was my roommate in Horog, Tajikistan. You'll see him a couple times today. This is something he told me. You know what? Why don't you just come stay with me for the weekend, and then we can see what we want to do after that. Don't worry about paying rent. This is my grandmother's old apartment, and it's always better to live with people. You can pay me with English lessons and practice. I can even make you shir choy every day for breakfast, but I already have shir choy every day for breakfast. Maybe you can show me how to make something else. Some people chase the northern lights. I know some people who saw good weather in Tromsø and they took a flight up here, a really expensive flight. I don't know, I'm not the biggest fan of the northern lights. They always look better through a camera anyway. Once they were New Oulu and I went out and set out my camera, I stood out there for the next 3 nights. But I like to chase sunsets instead. I'd come all the way out here for a sunset. The sunrise will come soon after, because this is the most northern point of Norway, so it's the last. It was really funny. We got there at the last day of the last day when there was a sunset. So it was the last sunset of the year, and it was like sunset and then immediately sunrise, and this guy was really into it. I come all the way out here for a sunset. The sunrise will be soon hereafter, so why would you sleep? Look, we're here. I might cry. This could be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't like people asking me where I'm from. They'll just go on and think something completely stupid about me that's not even true. I'm not from anywhere. I'm from the moon. So in 2012, I had finished university. I had worked in a cafe for a couple years, and I was thinking, like, what is there, what's there to do? And one day I just thought, maybe I'll leave. I'll check something else out. And there were no big plans. I was literally listening to an Icelandic band and reading an Argentinian book, and I'm like, okay, Iceland, Argentina, that was it. Just very, very split-second decisions. So I pack my bag, I go to Europe, start thinking about Iceland, and I met some girls who were just like, we're just gonna hitchhike. We're gonna go from point A to point B. And I'm like, oh wow, that sounds crazy, but maybe I could try that. And so I did, and I was hooked after that. And I'm sure, as many of you know, there's this Schengen zone in Europe. Canadians, we can only have 90 days there, so I had to get out pretty fast, because the more days I spent there, the less days I could spend in Iceland, and so I made it into the Balkans and into East Europe. And all of it, this was a space that I had never really thought about in my life before. I'm like, okay, there's something interesting here. Maybe I'll stick around for a little bit. And I would continue hitchhiking. So these pictures are all either from drivers who took me places, and I would just write down bits of their stories, or people who hosted me on Couchsurfing, who I met in hostels. For whatever reason, I just really enjoyed listening to people, and something very interesting started happening in the Balkans. You'd cross these borders, and you would start hearing the same stories in completely different ways. So as a lot of us know, there was a war there a few decades ago, and a lot of the drivers who were old enough to drive me were younger back then, and they remembered a lot of these different things. And so this was kind of my first experience of getting to know what narratives feel like. I was a child when the bombs were falling in Belgrade. I remember we had to go underground into the bomb shelters. But when you're a kid, you don't think about it too much. We thought it was a lot of fun being in the dark like that. So being from Canada, I would hear very specific narratives. And so in the narratives that I heard, the Serbs were the bad guys. I'm not here to talk about like what's true or not true. There is evidence, there is a record. I'm talking about what my impressions were. So what I found interesting were hearing the narratives of people that I hadn't heard, the stories that I hadn't heard. And so I listened to not only Croatians, Bosnians, Kosovars, but also Serbians. And that was something that was interesting. I live in a part of Bosnia called Republika Srpska, and it's complicated here. There are always going to be people who act like all Serbs are monsters. Yes, Srebrenica happened, and yes, it was a war crime, but it doesn't mean all Serbs are genocidal. That's not how people work. There were war crimes everywhere, not just with the Serbian armies. So these are verbatim things that I heard. I'm not going to analyze these different narratives, but this is something that I encountered when I was going through the Balkans that's very, very real now, because at this point we have another war, we have another state that's an aggressor state, and there are a lot of people who came here very recently who are now very affected by the reputation of their country. And this is complicated because when you have limited resources, limited attention, who do you pay attention to, you know? As I'm sure a lot of you have met Russians while you're here, and there is suffering within that community, but there's a lot more suffering in the Ukrainian community. What do you do with that? How do you spend your attention? What do you focus on? What decisions do you make about what stories you tell and retell? So fast track to just under a year ago, after the bombs started falling in Kiev and other cities. Me and like a lot of other people that I work with, we were panicking. We were trying to see, like, is there anything we can do with refugees? Can we find host homes? Can we do this? Can we do that? And I was in this very kind of manic state because this is just this complete disaster, right? And I got an interesting message from somebody that I know from Canada, and I don't think you'll be able to see. Is this readable? So it says somebody who, I also run different events and different kind of workshops and different like performance things, and so somebody who came to events that I had run in Canada messaged me kind of out of the blue saying, would you be interested in a different view on the Russia-Ukrainian atrocities? And I know this person, and I know what perspective they're often trying to bring, and I was kind of having none of this. Because in the West, there was a certain narrative, a certain voice that was saying, oh, we're hearing about Ukraine so much, maybe that means there's something on the other side. But I was just like, a different view from what? It seems like all I see around me are different views. This is me being passive-aggressive because of the parallel universe we've had to live in these past 2 weeks, and I'm under-resourced to be charitable at the moment. I get that. I honor your process. I'm very easily triggered in this kind of state. I really get it, and thank you for your honesty and self-awareness. So at that point we stopped, but then as time went on, I started a fundraiser because friends were leaving, we had to get certain things done, people were losing their jobs, and then she donated. And I said, thanks for the donation. So this person believes a lot of things that I would frame as conspiracy theories. And so there are some narratives in the West about how it's the West's fault, it's actually NATO, it's XYZ, Russia was forced to do this, which are not things that I believe. And it's interesting because when I think about my own desire to, oh, what's the Serbian side of the story? Maybe that would trigger a lot of Croatians. Maybe that would trigger a lot of Bosnians. And in this case, I was completely triggerable because of the work that I'd done in Ukraine prior to the war, and I was in this situation, the same. So it's one thing to talk about narratives. It's another thing to have the space of mind to consider these different sides, and sometimes you just can't do that. So hitchhiking, driving, listening to all these stories. People are triggered. People want to listen to something. People don't want to listen to something else. But at the same time, there's something that's really cool. Sometimes when you sit with this dilemma and you get past some of this weird black and white stuff, and you stop thinking about what's right or wrong, and you just encounter each other as these weird human beings with personal experiences that led them to what they think today, sometimes you get to this very, very magic spot where you're just able to kind of appreciate this, just kind of like how fucked up this all is. And it's kind of cool that we're here together and somehow we have to find a way through this. And it's a very special spot. And so that space that I don't know if you guys have ever encountered that space where you can reach in conversations with people, where you can step outside yourself and encounter the other as human, this was something that became very, very precious to me. Sometimes you find really weird stuff in old houses. There was this tradition back then that you could protect your home by finding a pointed witch shoe and filling it with piss. You'd have to put it in the walls as it was being built. So sometimes when I'm tearing houses apart, I find a few old, stinky shoes. I love what I do. I'll never see the inside of an office. We want to treat the two of them like they're normal people. If they do something wrong, then we explain it to them like adults, and usually that solves the problem. If our kids have a tantrum or lose their temper, it usually means there's something else going on, so we try to find the reason. The jar over there, the one that sparkles like a snow globe. It's something we give them when they're on a timeout. It's less about punishment and more about calming them down. We don't want to step on their vitality while they're still little. I take people out to my family's house on a mountain when I have time. Sometimes I work a lot, but sometimes I don't work at all. We have dogs up there on the mountain. It's good when travelers come visit. Some people come to Colombia for the beach. Some come to Colombia for healing plants. Some for whatever. I don't care. I have trouble sleeping, and I like having people around. What would I do for $1 million? I don't want to buy a town, but I think I'd like to run a gas pipe to one, to put gas and electricity in everyone's houses so they don't have to chop wood every day in winter. I'd like them to stay warm, and maybe somewhere, someone could write down that I did it, so that in 70 years, someone can sit inside and think, hey, Siroga did this. This is the kind of space that became precious to me. And when you're on the road, something really interesting happens, because I was actually pretty lucky, because so for the first year or two, I was just hitchhiking. I would volunteer somewhere, I would hitchhike a bit more, and I'd go on these long trips. Eventually, so I went to Ukraine because I thought, okay, so there's Iceland and Argentina. I need to work somewhere. I need to teach English somewhere. Maybe Korea. Why don't I hitchhike to South Korea? And I look at the map, and there's a lot of Russia between Europe and South Korea. So I move in with some friends in Ukraine, and they basically start teaching me Russian. And after that, I think, wow, this is actually really cool. Why don't I go teach in Russia instead of Korea? At the time, that was 2013, so it was right before the Maidan Revolution. I was living in Lviv, which is a Western town where they speak Ukrainian mostly. But my friends, my closest friends, were from Lugansk, which is one of the spaces where that then became a hotbed for separatist activity less than a year later. And my good friend's village, small town, became right the border checkpoint. And so his mother left. He fled to the Netherlands, his brother fled to Moscow, and his mother, a refugee, went between them, between these pro-Ukrainian and these pro-Russian views. She didn't care, she just wanted to be safe, she wanted to be here near her sons. So I moved to Russia. After that, I started teaching. The war started in Donbass. Crimea was annexed, and because of the people that I knew from these areas, it was the first time that I really kind of looked and paid attention to a conflict like this. But at the same time, still, I was interested. Okay, like let's hear stories. Like it can't all be that simple. Let's try to see what this is about. But in the meantime, I started teaching. So Ben gave me a job. In the summers, I had time off. I would continue this. I would continue to go. I would continue to travel. But yeah, things. On the one hand, it was cool, but politics couldn't help but keep coming in. About a third of our budget comes from Russia. Everyone has family working there. A builder in Moscow can send more money home a month than his family might earn combined. A teacher in my village might earn $45 a month. A director might make $100 a month, and a family could live on that. But we can't live on what most of us make. We can't exist without Russia. No one can keep the best people here because they get educated and then they go if they can. I even want to go to Germany or Canada. We have no specialists left because we can't afford them, and the country is run by people who are left. There was always something to do at home. The wife, the yard, the dog, my daughter. The wife earns $500 a month, and with my salary combined, we get by. If I was in Latvia, I'd be making the same. But you know what? We couldn't live on that. I'd go and hang myself. Back in the Union, things weren't like that. The 90s happened, lawlessness. But then we joined the EU. They closed down all our factories, bought it up, or they went bankrupt. Who's going to give it back to the people? My wife divorced me after it ended, but that's okay because I had to leave anyway. I couldn't stay. I haven't spoken with my daughter for 10 years, and I don't want them to get hurt. I know one day I'll open the door and it'll be one of these guys smiling before putting a bullet between my eyes. I don't want my family mixed up in that. The criminals don't know who my family are, so I ran. I got into alcohol, everything. Misty here, my dog, she's all I got left. She has an ear infection. The guys I arrested, maybe 25 of them, they all got 10 years in jail, definitely no more than 20. But 200 more were there waiting to take their place. We never ended up rescuing those girls. I don't know, sometimes it's weird, kind of you sit in a car for like 8 hours a day and all you're doing is listening to stories. You're listening to these different perspectives, you're listening to these different histories, and people often give you these very kind of saturated highlights of their lives, right? And so all you do is you just listen, 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 collect. I was interested in collecting. I'd write stuff down. I'd post it on Facebook. There was nothing formal. These were all stuff that was just, that would end up on my wall. I picked you up so that they wouldn't rape you. This was the man who sexually assaulted me. We were driving to a festival. Everyone got very drunk. I woke up and he was sucking my dick. I stopped him, but I thought, was this rape? Was this sexual assault? How do I think about this? Does this affect how safe I feel on the road? Can I call this rape? I don't feel in danger. Is this taking away the power? Like, is this taking away a word that means something much more to somebody else? How do you process something like that? But this was a thing. I didn't really know how to talk about it. I would tell it as a funny story for a long time. It wasn't for a while until I thought about, okay, one of the reasons why I don't feel like shit is because as not good as the situation was, I didn't feel like I was stripped of power. I was able to defend myself, I was able to come to, I was able to stop the situation. But I had really nice memories of what was happening in that day before that. This was back in 2012. And 6 years later, they picked me up again in Croatia. For whatever reason, I was just like, wow, it's really cool that we meet the same people again. Because I wasn't in a super vulnerable spot, I wouldn't say that it wasn't triggering to see them again. And I don't really know what to make of that. But thinking about aggressions or acts like these, when you think about how you want to describe your experiences, something bad happened to you. I was comparing myself to victims of, I wasn't comparing myself, I was thinking about how do I talk about this? There are victims of rape that have traumas, that go through all these different things. If you didn't have such a negative experience, how do you compare that? And this is also something that's a really big question right now among the Russian community that I live with. It's okay, there's displacement, there's political chaos, there's turmoil. But the Ukrainians, again, what does my suffering mean in the face of this other kind of suffering? On the one hand, everyone's experiences are legitimate, but when you have, again, limited resources, when not everybody has the same runtime, where do you prioritize? What decision do you make? And then again, thinking about Russians and Ukrainians, what about the foreigners who made their home in places like St. Petersburg, who can't really come back right now? I'm not the only one in this room who's a foreigner in that situation. Are they displaced? Are they semi-displaced? Can you even use that language to talk about yourself because there's so much other suffering in the world? So one of the biggest questions when people asked me about hitchhiking is there danger, And it's danger? I don't know. There are funny stories. Are there funny stories? How do you talk about the stuff that happens? So what made this a confusing experience is that as a queer person, I'm also told that it's not that big of a deal. I have a friend who was at a festival and the same thing happened to him, but he enjoyed it. And he's like, okay, let's just keep going. But being a queer person when you're hitchhiking is also something that's quite complicated. Sometimes you get drivers prepositioning you. I was hitchhiking once through Chechnya, and everyone wanted to talk about queer stuff. I don't know why, but like probably every second person that I was speaking to was wanting to ask, is this how it really is in Canada, blah, blah, blah. One time I asked somebody, is this something that, like if I was queer, what would you do? They took out a knife. They said, it was a storm outside, it was very dramatic. And they said, if I couldn't, like my Russian wasn't great, their Russian wasn't great, something about either we drop you on the side of the road or we drop you on the side of the road and. So that was not great. In Siberia, I talked to a guy who was also so disgusted with queer people that he was my driver too, that he said once, I asked him, what would happen if your kid was queer? His kid was 10 years old. And if he said, no, this wouldn't happen, this isn't possible. No, he would like grip the wheel, he's like gripping the wheel like this. And I'm like, no, like, okay, it's not under your control. What if it happened? What if you couldn't control it? And he said, maybe there's one thing I could do. I could kill him. And it was just silence. And this guy, my impression, when I saw the look on his face, it was the first time that he admitted to himself the possibility of him killing his own child. And that just like went right through him. And I tried to talk to him for a bit, and he's like, no, can we just not talk for a while? We had, I don't know, like an 8-hour drive, so eventually we started talking again, and it's weird because on the one hand, what do you do with that? Do you take a stand? Because after that, it was a very intimate space. He kept talking, he started sharing about his life, about his experience. Is that a red line after which you say, no, I can't talk to you anymore? Do you accept his human story? Where are the red lines? And we talk again about Russia, about Ukraine right now. Where are the red lines after which we say, no, no contact. This is not something that I want. So eventually I transitioned out of teaching. I wanted to be a freelance writer. I thought I could try to do both. It turns out that it was really hard. If any of you guys are language teachers, you know that planning can be quite difficult. It takes up a lot of your time. So every time I tried to go more into writing, the planning would take in, I wouldn't make much money, so I'd go back to teaching, and it was like this cycle that go back and forth. And I'm sure that I tested the patience of Ben and our other colleagues because I was just like, maybe, maybe not. It was very much kind of like a dance for a little bit. But eventually I said no. I wanted to go on writing. And I thought, okay, so now I'm a nomad. I can do that. I can write. I'm out of teaching. A friend of mine at this time, she invites me to go traveling with her to Colombia. And it turns out that she coordinates this activist collective in St Petersburg that I'd known about. I had gone to different events and things like this, and we were there together, again, hitchhiking, very close quarters. I normally travel alone. And she was telling me about projects. She was telling me about activism. It's like, I'm just like, okay, that's interesting. But she said, no, anybody can start anything. Anybody can just do something. If you have an idea for an event, you don't need any structure. You can just write a Facebook post, send it to people, find a space, and just do it. And this was like, it blew my mind. I'm like, wow, I could actually just start something anything that I wanted. And I thought, okay, now that I'm writing, now that I'm not teaching, I can have space to start some kind of project. And so when I go back to St Petersburg, she's like, do something with us, do something with our collective. And I thought, okay, so maybe something a little bit connected to teaching, maybe something with a little more social. And I think, what am I passionate about? And I think about all of these stories, and it's like that space. Is there something we can do to try to create that space, like in that conversation with people, that connection? And so I created a project called Kitchen Talks. So it was an English language. First, it was just like a conversation club where we only talked about controversial topics, where everybody comes and they offer their different narratives, their different sides. So something kind of in the middle between teaching and social project, but then it kind of evolved into this kind of thing all of its own. And we created like this dialogue space where people could come. Every week we talked about something else, but usually like Crimea, child-free life choices, feminism, substances, things like this. And I was really enjoying it. And a year or so after that, some guy came to our town and showed us a documentary, another one of these events, just there. And it was about a process where Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo were talking to each other in the context of their war. And that was something that was interesting because I thought, okay, like this is something that I hear about a lot while hitchhiking. What's that going to be like? And it turns out that people actually do this thing where they create group events and spaces where people come to share narratives, to encounter the other, and to see if you can find some kind of common humanity or common ground. It's called dialogue. And I remember nearly crying when I'm watching this documentary because I thought, there's somebody who's doing this. So this is a thing. You can actually try to do that. So immediately after that, I'm just like, okay, I go to all the summer schools I can, and it's like peacebuilding and conflict theory and all these different things. And I come back and I continue going to these, doing these spaces. And it's like, okay, so let's do, like, and it became more, like, I incorporated more exercises, more this, more that, and it really became more of a dialogue space than just a regular kind of English club. And then we created like other workshops about like different techniques you can use, and it became an ecosystem in St. Petersburg. Soon there were different people running different events, and this dialogue group became like the gateway drug for that. A lot of people would go to this, they would get interested in dialogue, and then they'd go, okay, what does nonviolent communication mean? What does it mean like to do narrative work? What are different techniques for this and that? And so we created that, and this was something that we continued to do for the next few years. And for me, it was really like this soul food. With hitchhiking, though, it was more intense because you sit in this car for like 10 hours with somebody, and you really try to get to the core of what some of their views are. But there was something interesting here, because when you're doing it for its own sake, it's something more like art. Like it's just something that's beautiful, it's an encounter that you have. And this is, I don't know, when you're doing something like this, you're an activist. You want to create spaces, you want to make some kind of, maybe not a change in the world, but you do something for a purpose. And that's a very interesting tension. Are you doing things for the sake of it, or do you want to make change? Fast forward to last year. Since then, I got more involved with peacebuilding stuff. I did an MA in conflict studies. I started working with a research center in Kiev that applies dialogue practices to the conflict before the invasion. And then just something happens and everything is interrupted. Everybody panics. And it's like, do stories matter when there are like bombs? And do stories matter when there's a map like that? And do stories and narratives matter when people are dying and it's just really awful? And so what do? There's this dialogue space, there's this magic in there, but it doesn't stop bombs. Is this something that's worthwhile to still continue doing? Peacebuilding practitioners, they have this thing, they say that, because sometimes dialogue really does help. So for example, with South Africa, before the fall of apartheid, they had these secret dialogues that then led into the official negotiation processes, which then led to the fall of apartheid, the release of Nelson Mandela. It's like one of these really big success stories. So sometimes like it's the right time. This is something that people call ripeness. So when the conflict is ripe for transformation, when the conflict is ripe to change. But it doesn't always happen. So everyone thought that Israel and Palestine was ripe when they were doing these peace negotiations in Oslo. Some of you might have heard of it, the Oslo agreements. They made a peace deal, but then it fell apart because people weren't really into it. Sometimes people think the moment is ripe when it's not. But, so that's ripeness. On the other side, there's something that people call readiness, which is okay. Maybe you can't see a way out. Maybe you don't see where the ripeness will come. Maybe things seem hopeless, but you try to put the pieces in place so that when the opportunity does arrive, maybe you'll be ready to act on it. So one colleague of mine, he calls it kind of venture capital for peace, where you invest in something not knowing it's going to pay off, but like it's there. And so some people, they just invest in dialogues all over the world in these like different really intense conflicts, hoping that maybe if the wind turns just the right way, one of these dialogues might make a difference. So this, thinking about dialogue, is kind of the mindset that a lot of people are using about the Ukrainian context and other contexts. Because when you talk, so my colleagues in Ukraine who are dialogue facilitators, they're just like, and these are just my colleagues, they don't represent everybody, but they're just like, please give us support, give us weapons. We support dialogue, but we need the ability to do armed resistance. We need to find a way to do both at the same time. And so to do dialogue between like Russians and Ukrainians is something that's not quite, some of us might think it's an important thing to do, but it's not the highest priority on the list of the people who are really suffering there. So, how can you be ready in a situation like that? Can you try to find that space where people can, does that space mean anything when there's something that's just so terrible happening? I don't know. I think that on an individual level, there are things that can be done. But right now, so there are projects that are trying to actually get ready for potential Russian-Ukrainian dialogues and negotiations. Like, obviously, like, you can't say much about it right now, but those processes are happening. I'm participating in some of them, and we're going to see what's going to happen. And even though this like special moment of connection, this humanity, it's not there right now, that's still something that's like this really big motivation, at least for me. And it's really strange because we're going to be starting some projects very soon, and a lot of this really started like 10 years ago in these trucks. Just like, what does it mean to have an education, just sitting there and listening and asking questions and encountering the other, and what can that lead to? But there are no answers yet. There are a lot of different tries. I think a lot of peace builders have a similar experience in that they get into the business that doesn't pay very well sometimes, because they care about something. And at some point, you have to think about what the chances are of actually making an impact, and that is not a very flattering picture. But you try to be ready. And you have to try to be ready in ways that don't make the situation worse. And so that's kind of a big question and dilemma for peace builders right now. So this isn't a workshop about all these different things. It's about what can bring somebody, what can lead somebody into this kind of work, and what are these questions, and how are they manifesting, and what are the limitations for this right now? So there's no answers. I could tell you names like Solidar, Mariupol, Popasna, which are all cities in this area that are very destroyed. Some of them are complete ruins. And there are other more important things than dialogue at the moment. But that's a tension that comes with the territory. And one thing that helps me, this is an image from a book by a guy called Italo Calvino. He has really interesting books. He often writes these kind of weird postmodern kind of fable stuff. And this book is called Invisible Cities. And every chapter is just a description of a different city that doesn't exist. That's just kind of like a weird, interesting, almost poem in prose form. And there's no plot. Just very, very, like, it's basically Marco Polo telling the Kublai Khan, the king of Mongolia, that about all the different towns he'd been to. And it's just a description of every single town. And then at the end, the very last page, it's them there again. And there's this excerpt that means quite a lot to me. Yeah, when I think about what does it mean to try to be ready when there's no opening, that seems very possible. Yeah, I don't know. I'll just read it, and you can make of it what you want. But for me, it was important. Already the great Khan, Kublai Khan, was leafing through his atlas over the maps of the cities that menace in nightmares and maledictions. Enoch, Babylon, Yahuland, Batua, Brave New World. He said, "It is all useless if the last landing place can only be the infernal city, and if it is there that, in ever-narrowing circles, the current is drawing us." And Marco Polo said, "The inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here, the inferno where we live every day that we form just by being together. There are two ways to accept suffering from it. The first is easy and for many. Accept the inferno and become part of it so that you no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and attention. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the middle of inferno is not inferno. Then make them endure. Give them room." Travel. I was going to too, but then my baby came along 2 years ago, and I stayed, and I married my husband, and that was that. I'm 21 now, but I regret nothing. My baby's the best thing that ever happened to me. But I understand why they are here. No matter how bad things get in Germany, it's always worse in their home country. That's why they have to come. That's why we must let them in. I don't always like dancing, but sometimes I can't behave myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. So, yeah, I have a bunch of questions, but yeah, first of all, I think it would be really good to hear other questions first, because mine are too academic, I guess. Yeah, so who would be first one? Or I can start. Maybe I can start and then we proceed. I would really like to ask you about like your personal encounters, but one of the first questions that I had, and maybe it's a very superficial one, but I'm not ashamed, and I believe that many people would have it. And that's a question that I'm personally trying to be very careful with, but at the same time it's really hard to be objective about it. It's a question of the agency of being peace builder. I think it's very familiar struggle to you too. And this never-ending discussion of like relation between local and international peace building environment or impacts, maybe, right? So how you dealt with it, not like, we are not aiming at deconstructing terms, obviously, here, but from your personal experience, how you, when you were entering this field, were you questioning yourself if you had agency or not? And when you learned more about it, what are your approach and what are your tools for keeping this balance in between, right, of local international but respective, not invading.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So this is actually a really interesting question. If so, just so I make sure I understand it right. It's like is it about like my personal agency? Do I feel like I have control, like as a peace builder? Do I like have an impact on something? Like what do we mean by agency?
Yeah, I would comment. So it would be really great if you would take like an example of how you personally were discovering this position, and how you were questioning, or if you were questioning yourself at all, and if you can tell a couple of words about what is the struggle between local and international peace building in general, I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So I think because I come from a fairly privileged background, I haven't had to struggle with a lot of agency questions because, like for example, when I was hanging out with my friend who was telling me about these about projects and that you can just do something, this was, for me, the agency question is, do I have the ability to just do something? Do I have to wait for somebody else, you know? And eventually I realized that no, I don't. You can just make something and it doesn't have to be perfect. And so we just like started this like dialogue project, like just as nothing. And now like we're actually like getting funding for some major interesting projects that like came from like, that's kind of started and had roots there, you know what I mean? And so like a lot of things seem kind of stupid or meaningless. And then sometimes something happens, you know? And so for me, the choice, like when I think about agency, it's can you do something or not, even if you don't have a guarantee that it's going to make a difference. So that was how I framed it for myself, which is different than what you're talking about. But in terms of what you're talking about, so again, I'm involved with the Ukrainian community of dialogue facilitators. And so we do research and we do different like other things. And when the invasion started, they wanted to kind of create space to figure out for themselves what they want to do. And so there was actually this really interesting, almost kind of a scandal. They decided that they wanted to. They basically put together a statement of like you can all Google it if you want, like 7 points about dialogue in the war in Ukraine, and they basically said that like. This whole framework of like we need to bring people together and we need people to talk and we need to like make both sides equal. They're just like, no, this is stupid because there's an aggressor. We're fighting for our lives. This dialogue model doesn't work. Anybody who tries to impose this on us is like doing this really bad thing. And a lot of this was with frustration with how a lot of the international peace building and dialogue community wanted to think, oh, war, okay, so now we need to start our dialogue projects there and we need to do it in this way because we did it in the Balkans and so obviously it's going to work in Ukraine. And so a lot of Ukrainians were like, no, we need to figure out how to do this by ourselves. Like we want to find a way to combine armed resistance with dialogue and we want to basically have personal ownership and personal agency, and like they use these statements to try to create legitimacy for them taking control of their narrative in that way, which was this really interesting thing that was happening, but it made a lot of dialogue facilitators mad because the Ukrainians basically said in the statement that there's no dialogue that's possible right now that would not harm Ukrainians because their energies were so much going into defending themselves that to distract from that by humanizing the other and by like trying to reach out, it would distract them from doing the things they needed to do to survive. And so for them, like seeing this dialogue framework that was being imposed on them was like, yeah, it was like this really bad thing. So there was this struggle between the local, which was asking for one thing, and there were international actors who agreed with that and said we need to amplify these voices, and there were international actors that said, like, no, this is a barrier to dialogue. Yeah.
Can I have a little follow-up question? Yeah. So in this case, in the case of Ukraine and the current stage of invasion, the thing was about like channeling the energy and efforts. It was not about hierarchical conflict, that you are people from
there was also this
international community trying to teach us. As you mentioned, people were trying, some experts were trying just to copy-paste kind of practices of the Balkans. and implement them, some of them, in Ukraine, and it wasn't working.
Or it wasn't that they weren't working, they were just resisting that because they had an idea of what their needs were, and they're like, we don't need this. This is going to mess things up. We don't want you to do this thing that you normally do. And so you were asking if it was also just about the energy or like these asymmetrical relationships. It was a lot of those different things. It's all in the statement. I really recommend that people check that out if they're interested. But they built, we'll share it. Yeah, it's they made a very specific case about why this is not the right moment for dialogue and what might need to be in place for that dialogue to happen in the future. And so this also kind of informs, like there are, for example, preparations on the Russian side, not the pro-Putin Russian side, to create readiness for if there's a space for dialogue in the future, what needs to be in place now. It's because there was a lot of contact between Russians and Ukrainians from the same communities, so like activists or artists or peace builders, and it was very kind of re-traumatizing for a lot of Ukrainians because of certain things that the Russians said that they didn't know was triggering or traumatizing, or they didn't know if something kind of gave this impression of imperialism. So there's a lot of things that need to be done on the Russian side first before kind of this like safe space contact can actually happen, right? And so I think there's a lot of different reasons why the Ukrainians are like, okay, one, like there's like all these things. Two, there's a war, and like we kind of have to like not die. So like a lot of that stuff is in there, and their positions are evolving, and hopefully there are going to be some reports that are going to be published soon about how those conversations are going right now, and hopefully there'll be more to share, I think, soon.
Okay. So.
And also, so when Ben and I were talking about this, like, again, this wasn't like a peace building talk, this is more like personal life, blah, blah, blah. And so, but if you guys actually have like questions about peace building and stuff, like that's like also okay if it's like theoretical and not about what was talked about. So whatever you guys are curious about. But
actually,
You talked a bit about finding, like when you encounter a view, when you're trying to listen to someone and their perspective, if you encounter a view that is, well, very opposite to ones that you hold and are very passionate about, finding like the red line of where you don't go. Do you feel that it's the responsibility in these sort of dialogues to keep the dialogue open and to listen as the priority, or is there ever a point where you feel there might be a responsibility to challenge a certain view that is given to you?
So it depends what your priorities are, you know? And so in peace building theory, there's this thing called positive peace and negative peace. And like, they're not like good and bad, but positive and negative, but like negative peace is like your vision of how the conflict ends is that often there's like the threat or the violence disappears. It doesn't matter how it happens. So maybe I create a safe space where I just don't encounter the other person. Maybe I defeat them. Maybe I re-educate them. Those are all kinds of negative peace. So there's this thing that's threatening me, and I just want it to be gone, you know? And like when people are under threat and when people are in these situations, this is often a priority, right? And so thinking about, do I engage with the other person, or do I like say that, like, do I want a negative piece versus a positive piece, which is like, how do you build a common future that includes this other person, you know, where like all needs are kind of taken into account. And like ideally everyone's like, oh, positive peace, but like we live in a world with like limited resources. And so for example, the Ukrainians, a lot of peace building practitioners were like, okay, so let's start talking about the foundations of positive peace. Let's start talking about like the positive Russian-Ukrainian relationship like years down the road. And the Ukrainians are just like, whoa, like give us a gun, you know? And this is like the armed conflict version of I need to respond to you in that way. I'm not going to let that pass. It's like this needs to be resisted, basically. And so whether you choose to resist or whether you choose to engage to create this human space depends on what your needs are at the moment. One thing that's interesting about facilitated dialogue is that when it's done like well, a facilitator can create a safe space for people to kind of feel like they're not going to be as triggered as they normally are when there's a view that comes up. So sometimes the facilitator helps a person who would normally respond to say, okay, I believe this, I think that this needs to be challenged, but I'm also curious, why do you believe that? What's your human experience? How did this affect you personally? So sometimes both of those things can happen. But it also depends if it's a dialogue space or it's an activist space or what kind of space it is. So that's kind of not really an answer to your question, but like there's lots of different ways to kind of get at that. And I think also you choose what you choose to do, and like no matter what your choice is, there are going to be consequences. So.
Thank you.
No worries. Actually, also one thing that's interesting is there's also research out there that's beginning to understand that in cases where there's dialogue between groups that are privileged and underprivileged or that have like asymmetrical power, they notice that in successful dialogue, the relationships become stronger, like they become very positive towards each other, but they notice that the underprivileged group becomes less interested in fighting to correct the injustice. So sometimes dialogue has the effect that these structural elements continue to go unaddressed. And so people are trying to figure out, like, is there a way that we can do both? But like I think this is a problem when you only think about dialogue as like one thing versus dialogue and resistance, dialogue and structural reform and XYZ. And like those things often clash with each other in different ways. And so one of the big tasks of peace builders, and I work both in the Ukrainian and Russian context, but I also work in this kind of polarization culture war space in North America. And this is a big question there too. It's like under what conditions do you engage and do you want to engage, and how do you balance the need that we have to depolarize and to reweave the social fabric and find healing, and the task to figure out what's wrong with our societies and also try to address that. And so this is like one of the key questions right now, as it always is. There's a question over here.
Yeah.
Maybe you can give a couple of examples about like what are these circumstances when people can go from like this like triggered state, I would say, to the more like when they are able to hear an opposite party. So like for me it's more like practice question, because like what can be done like to maybe to bring your kind of opponent to this like table, like I mean like besides that like the shooting should stop and so on.
Yeah. So again, it depends on like how extreme the violence is, but also how you respond to it, right? So sorry, can you repeat the first part of your question?
Yeah, just give like examples about like for instance like there is like very how to say triggered people, and when they becoming like more or less like agree to hear another party.
Yeah. So there are different things that can kind of be done for that. So there's one technique in kind of school called nonviolent communication, where the point is when we're in this kind of conflict situation, it's I prioritize you feeling seen and heard. So when you're saying like, I'm just like, oh, do you feel this because you need this and you'd prefer me to do something else? Sometimes when somebody hears what they actually like feel, there's like this, like the other person sees me, the other person understands me. And sometimes after that, they're more willing, it basically kind of like de-triggers them, right? When there's a group dialogue context, the facilitator tries to create a safe space using different techniques and stuff, and that helps some people feel more safe. It's like, like some things that might make people feel triggered is like the safety, not feeling seen, your needs aren't met. So maybe if somebody's, for example, the Ukrainians, their need for safety is not met. You know, maybe that's something that needs to be worked on first before you can start thinking about dialogue, right? But it also, sometimes the same situation can have impacts on the same thing can impact two completely different people in different ways. So, for example, when I was sexually assaulted, I didn't find this a traumatic experience because I didn't feel like my power was taken away. Somebody else who was in a similar situation but felt like their power was taken away, they would have a very different experience of that. because of that, I found that I was able to speak about it and kind of engage with the person who did it to me in a very different way, because I wasn't triggered by it. The first time when I saw him 6 years later, I was like, I wanted to talk. Like, I didn't feel like I needed to push him away. But like, that was my story, you know? And so everyone's red line is going to be different. And a lot of it has to do with how secure you feel in that moment, what are your needs, are they met? Do you feel like this person can do it again? Do you feel like you're able to protect yourself? All these different elements are really important in this. And so that's why it's also really important for facilitators or peace builders to work in specific contexts and really know what the dynamics are, because if people come from one context to another and they bring with them this other method or baggage, like it can re-traumatize people or trigger them. So like we could talk forever about examples. I don't know if you wanted to hear more, or if...
Oh, no, just I know it's this sounds a little bit abstract, and I am trying to like realize, for instance, like it's not secret, like I'm Russian, and I'm really care about like how like Russian society in a like long perspective can like communicate with our neighbors, and I believe that the war will like end at some point, and so what will be our steps toward to this dialogue?
So there are things that people can do to get ready. So for example, understanding the Ukrainian, like the things that can trigger Ukrainians. So we had an anti-war festival in the fall, and there was a conversation online with like Ukrainians and Russians, and it got kind of heated because some of the Russians were saying things that they didn't know would trigger the Ukrainians. So for example, all the Ukrainians knew about all the Russian feminist collectives, but the Russians didn't know anything about the Ukrainian collectives. So it was like this big disbalance where like certain things were treated as common knowledge and certain things were not, right? So like those kinds of imbalances can be really like triggering in a context where already somebody feels like they're being erased because like Putin was saying that Ukraine is not a state, that Ukrainians are Russians, they're one people, like this kind of thing. So in context of erasure, those things can be really triggering, right? So like getting to know like what those triggers are, kind of learning how kind of imperialism communicates itself without us knowing it, things like this, but also just prioritizing their safety. So yeah.
Can I add something? Maybe you can elaborate on it. One of the milestones in this case, I've been a part of this festival, so I remember very well that discussion, particularly. So answering a little bit your question is very important.
Could you maybe speak?
It's very important to consider the intensity of bringing good and openness and offers for dialogue to people who are being unsafe at the moment, because we come across it very often, particularly from the Russian side, for example, right now, including activists and people who have some knowledge, who would love to establish some communication as soon as possible. Without listening that carefully, maybe to the readiness of another party to.
I think,
and it's a very tricky question, because like it's good to initiate some peace building talks, but again, with a lot of care for another party.
And I think this is really key. Like, is the thing that you're doing communicate care for the other person, or does it communicate what I want to do with them, you know? And if a Ukrainian is like trying to do something important and a Russian comes for dialogue and they don't have time, they're just like, you know, it's like, this is like, it's just disaster, you know? So it's tricky. One thing that I found was really cool about this festival was that we invited, the organizers invited like 2 Serbian women to come, and they shared their story, and that was actually really cool because there aren't many models of how to do this. And it was cool because these women were basically kind of our age when their war started, and they were talking about the experience of what does it mean to be citizens of an aggressor state in this context, or a state that like people consider to be the aggressor. And so there's this government and this regime, and what do you do to build peace when people don't want to see you because you have this passport, you know? And so I think that building more, obviously the Balkan case is different, and it's like has different complexities because like there were things that were happening on all sides, and not everybody was powerless that said they were powerless. But learning from other people who are in similar situations, I think, is also really, really good because they were starting to think about, okay, you know, like you're all talking about dialogue, but we didn't start connecting with our counterparts for like 2 or 3 or 4 years, you know? And even then it was this slow process of rebuilding relationships. So yeah, like considering the needs of the other side, making them prioritizing their needs. If there's an asymmetry, like how do you help strengthen the other side that's like weaker or more vulnerable in that way? And like learning from other people who have been in similar situations. And yeah. I think we have one over here.
Thank you very much for your talk and for the conversation. So I have a pretty specific question about the language aspect of kind of peace building. And more specifically, there's a lot of talk right now about the fact that, of course, Russians and Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians speak Russian, or they understand Russian at least, and there is no such big difference between Ukrainians. So they're, of course, white people. Russians are white people. So it's almost like, I mean, a lot of Ukrainian kind of, I would say, anthropologists right now talking about the fact that it's as if you're fighting your mirror image unless someone opens their mouth. And I believe that there is also a big intersection, especially with the conflicts in the Balkans in the past. Are there any good studies or literature about the importance of language in peacekeeping, and whether there has to be any kind of mediator language, or whether there has to be any kind of cool-off moment when language kind of stops being this kind of physical sort of like a trigger for people who hear it. And of course, there's a very long history of Russian language being enforced on many, many nations living in the Russian Empire, but just in general about contemporary peacekeeping. Are there any good studies or books about that? So
first, I just want to say that like, this is just like my position, and there are like lots of different kind of positions with this. Yeah, I think one of the things that makes dialogue hard is the linguistic question, because one of the languages is not neutral. And so one thing that was interesting about this dialogue that happened at the anti-war festival was most of the Ukrainians were speaking in Russian, but there was one Ukrainian who was speaking Ukrainian. And it was translated for us. And so some people, it was very important for them to not respond in Russian. I think that they understood, but they wanted to speak in Ukrainian. I would disagree, though, about the linguistic kind of, I don't know if you were framing it kind of like as a linguistic divide, like the kind of like different language groups against each other. Okay, yeah, because I hear more, like obviously there's this like element of like, okay, so if you do it in like Russian or Ukrainian, there's this like disbalance. If you hold talks in English, there's this whole other imperialism that's being involved, you know? So the talks I would really recommend watching this documentary. It's called Reunion, 10 years after the war, about the Kosovo, like Kosovan Serbs and Albanian situation. They were speaking mostly in English. And so this was one thing that helped them to kind of distance themselves from that aspect, because for a lot of them, Serbian was also this triggering language, right? So you basically have to pick your poison in that way. Because we're not all going to learn Esperanto. But in terms of studies, I find that there's more studies, or that I've paid more attention to not the linguistic element, but the ideological element, in the sense that the fault line is like, and maybe I understood your question wrong in this way, but like this is what kind of made me think of, and I just wanted to kind of share this too, is that one of the things that also about this mirror image is that it's often an ideological divide. So people even who identify as like ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, they might fight for Ukraine because it's the idea, it's the mindset that's also this, So it's not like an ethnic conflict, it's not like a linguistic or a religious conflict, it's about what do you believe about the borders, and what do you believe about history, and what do you believe about political power. And for me, so this is something that, that I'm quite interested in, because sometimes in these dialogues, the other would disappear, because sometimes in these moments of connections, the person would change opinions, and all of a sudden dialogue is hard because sometimes the other is gone. And so how do you include people when it's not visible, when the fault lines aren't visible in communities? And so right now in the deoccupied parts of Ukraine, so Kherson and Kharkiv and these spaces, there are a lot of people who were left and people are often trying to figure out who are the collaborators and who are not. And again, it's like all the same villagers. You can't tell them apart. The only thing is what's going on in their minds. And this makes it a very, very difficult thing to sort through. But this is something that I find personally interesting also because in North America, there's also this ideological aspect. And so for me, like ideological identity groups is something that's quite new in the literature, I would say. But this is something that people are really, because there used to be people who would push the linguistic question in a way that was maybe a bit too far, but it's still important in that you have to talk somehow, and in what language, and what are the implications of that language, and how do you feel safe in what language you speak. So that was kind of also a bit of an off top, but yeah.
It's rather psycholinguistic rather than purely linguistic.
Yeah.
Linked to the trauma that is especially prevalent for a lot of Ukrainians. With the enforcement of the Russian language, but also even for just Russian speakers that are Ukrainians as well, because they also have this slight dysmorphia, and right now it's just very triggering for everyone.
Yeah, and there's also this thing where some of the IDPs and displaced people from the East who don't really have good Ukrainian skills are going to the West and settling, and there can be tensions because of the linguistic barrier, because in the west of Ukraine there's a lot more Ukrainian speakers, and so this presents actually a very kind of hot question that is much better now than it was, but it was a really big deal for a while. Yeah, and because a lot of people are like, some people are compelling Russian speakers to speak Ukrainian, and this is also this kind of thing where it's like, what's more important at this point? And is that imposition okay in that way? And so that's also a conversation that's happening. And for others, it's like, no, I want to speak Ukrainian even though I don't speak it very well, And so it's a very complex, that's another complex element of the linguistic question. But